The harsh wind swept through Sweetwater Creek as Zara Vance clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Feeling the stares of yet another family, who had just slammed their door in her face, the 10th family to reject her in as many weeks. It was 1878 in the Wyoming Territory, and being a 22-year-old deaf woman with no family meant Zara existed in a world that had little use for her. Most saw her as a burden, damaged goods to be pitted at best, scorned at worst. The families seeking mail-order brides or housekeepers wanted someone who could hear instructions, respond to danger, and communicate without the complicated gestures Zara relied upon. She trudged back toward the dusty main street of Whispering Pines, her stomach growling from hunger. The small town was her temporary home, though home was a generous term for the corner of the livery stable where she'd been sleeping. Winter would arrive soon, and she'd need proper shelter or she wouldn't survive. Zara felt the vibration of hoofbeats through the packed dirt road before she saw the rider. A tall man on a chestnut stallion came thundering into town, his face obscured by trail dust and the shadow of his hat. The horse slowed as it approached the general store, and the rider dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Owen Tucker had just ridden 15 miles in punishing heat to deliver a herd of cattle to the railroad station. At 30 years old, he'd built a respectable ranch 10 miles outside of town. But his success had come at the cost of solitude. His ranch hands were good men, but at night when they returned to their families, Owen sat alone in his cabin, the emptiness echoing louder than any sound. Zara kept her eyes down as she passed the stranger, but a gust of wind snatched her shawl and sent it fluttering toward his boots. She turned quickly, her heart sinking as her only possession landed in the dusty street. Owen bent to retrieve the faded fabric, looking up to find its owner. His breath caught at the sight of her dark hair falling loose from its pins, eyes the color of summer sage, and a face that spoke of both hardship and dignity. When he held out the shawl, she stepped forward cautiously, reaching for it without meeting his gaze. "Here you go, miss," he said, then frowned when she didn't respond. Zara felt his eyes on her but couldn't read his lips with his face partially shadowed by his hat. She pointed to her ears and shook her head, the gesture she'd used countless times to explain her condition. Understanding dawned in Owen's eyes. Instead of the pity or dismissal Zara expected, he removed his hat and stepped into better light. With deliberate movements, he handed her the shawl and pointed to himself. "Owen," he said clearly, his lips forming the word with exaggerated care. Zara's eyes widened in surprise. She took the shawl and pointed to herself. "Zara," she spoke, her voice carrying the unique cadence of someone who had never heard her own words. Mrs. Patterson, the shopkeeper's wife, had been watching from the store's porch. She hurried over, eager to spread the latest gossip. "Mr. Tucker, don't waste your time," she said with false concern. "That girl's been turned away by every decent family in the county. She's deaf as a post, can't hear a thing. 10 families have already rejected her. What use is a woman who can't hear when there's danger coming?" Owen's jaw tightened as he watched Zara's face. Though she couldn't hear the words, she recognized the familiar pattern of dismissal in the woman's expression. "Is that so?" Owen replied, his voice level but carrying an edge that made Mrs. Patterson step back. 10 families, you say?" "Yes, poor thing, Mrs. Patterson continued. "The Millers took her in last week but sent her packing when she broke their good china, couldn't hear them calling out to be careful. Before that, the Johnsons tried, but their children couldn't communicate with her. It's a shame, really, but she's just too much trouble." Owen looked at Zara, noticing the pride in her posture despite the threadbare dress and worn boots. He thought about his empty ranch house, the meals eaten in silence, the work that never seemed to end. He thought about the hands he'd hired who couldn't read or write but were still valued for their skills. "She's not broken," Owen said firmly. loud enough for others gathering on the street to hear. "She's just deaf." He turned to face Zara directly, making sure she could see his face as he spoke slowly. "Would you like a job? At my ranch?" When Zara looked confused, Owen mimed cooking and cleaning, then pointed in the direction of his property. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by suspicion. She'd had similar offers before, from men with less honorable intentions. Reading her wariness, Owen turned back to Mrs. Patterson. "Tell her I'm offering honest work. Cooking, cleaning at the Tucker Ranch. Fair pay. Her own room with a lock on the door." The shopkeeper's wife looked between them, clearly disapproving but unable to find fault with the arrangement. Reluctantly, she used crude gestures to communicate the offer to Zara. Zara hesitated, studying Owen's face. Unlike the others, he'd looked directly at her when speaking, making an effort to be understood. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. Even if this arrangement didn't last, it would give her shelter as winter approached. Owen nodded back, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "Good. We'll leave after I finish my business." As he walked toward the general store, he heard Mrs. Patterson's disapproving whisper to another onlooker. "Wasting his time with that one. What use is she?" Owen paused, turning back to face the small crowd that had gathered. "She's not broken," he said clearly, "and she's coming to work for me." What he didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was the strange sense of recognition he'd felt looking into her eyes. Something about her resilience called to something in him, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. The journey to the Tucker Ranch took nearly 3 hours. Owen rode slowly, keeping his horse at a walk beside Zara, who traveled in a small wagon he'd borrowed from the livery. The terrain was rugged, and Owen found himself pointing out landmarks along the way, forgetting momentarily that she couldn't hear his explanations. Instead, he began to gesture, showing her the direction of the creek that provided water to his property, the distant mountains that sheltered the valley from the worst of the winter storms, and finally, as they crested a small rise, the ranch itself. The main house was modest but solid, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney. Several outbuildings clustered nearby: a barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and corral. 2 ranch hands were visible working with horses in the paddock. Zara's eyes widened as she took in the property. She'd expected a small homestead, not this thriving operation. For the first time since agreeing to come, she felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps here, away from the judgmental eyes of the townspeople, she might find a place where her deafness wasn't her defining characteristic. As they approached, the ranch hands paused in their work. Owen raised a hand in greeting, and they nodded back, their curious gazes shifting to Zara. "Boss brought back a woman," one whispered to the other. "About time," the older hand replied. "Maybe now we'll get decent meals instead of his burnt coffee and leathery biscuits." Owen helped Zara down from the wagon, then led her toward the house. Inside, the main room was sparsely furnished but clean, with a large fireplace dominating one wall. A wooden table with 6 chairs occupied the center of the room, and a few bookshelves lined another wall. Simple, practical, masculine. Zara stood awkwardly just inside the door, clutching her small bundle of possessions. Owen moved to stand in front of her, then pointed upstairs and motioned for her to follow. He led her to a small but tidy bedroom at the top of the stairs. The room contained a narrow bed with a quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the corral. He demonstrated the lock on the door, showing her how it worked, then stepped back into the hallway to give her space. Zara entered the room cautiously. She ran her fingers over the clean quilt, looked out the window at the vast landscape, and turned back to Owen with questioning eyes. He mimed cooking and cleaning, then held up 7 fingers before pointing to the sun and making a circling motion. 7 days of work, from sunrise to sunset. Then he pantomimed counting money and handed it to her. Zara nodded in understanding. She would work for weekly wages. The arrangement was clear enough. Owen hesitated, then pointed to himself, made a writing motion, and raised his eyebrows in question. Zara smiled for the first time since they'd met. She nodded enthusiastically and made the same writing motion. Relief washed over Owen's face. If she could read and write, communication would be much easier. He led her back downstairs to his small desk in the corner of the main room. From a drawer, he retrieved a slate board and chalk, then wrote a simple message. "Welcome to Tucker Ranch. Dinner at 6. Rest today." He handed it to Zara, who read it quickly, then took the chalk and wrote beneath his message. "Thank you. Can cook, clean, mend. I will work hard." Owen read her neat handwriting and nodded with approval. He wrote again, "2 ranch hands eat here too. Breakfast at 5. Zara's eyes widened at the early hour, but she nodded acceptance. She'd worked since childhood and was no stranger to dawn to dusk labor. She wrote, "I will be ready." Owen studied her for a moment, noticing the fatigue etched in her face and the way her shoulders slumped when she thought he wasn't looking. 10 families had rejected her, and who knew what else she'd endured before arriving in Whispering Pines. He took the slate again and wrote, "Rest now. I'll show you the kitchen later." Zara read the message, then looked up at him with an expression that suggested she wasn't accustomed to kindness. She nodded and retreated upstairs to her room. When she was gone, Owen sat heavily in his chair, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd acted on impulse, something he rarely did. His life operated on routine and careful planning. It was how he'd built his ranch from nothing, how he'd survived when others failed. Taking in a deaf woman he knew nothing about was a risk, yet something about her determined expression had spoken to him. "Not broken," he murmured to himself. "Just different." Outside, the ranch hands exchanged knowing looks as they watched the upstairs window where Zara's silhouette was visible. "Boss finally found himself a woman," the younger hand said. The older man shook his head. "Don't jump to conclusions, Billy. Mr. Tucker ain't the type to bring home just any woman." "What do you mean?" "I mean the boss has standards. If he brought her here, she's special somehow." They couldn't know how right those words would prove to be. Dawn arrived with golden fingers of light stretching across the horizon. Zara woke before the first rays touched her window, anxiety driving her from bed. This was her chance, perhaps her last chance, to prove her worth. 10 families had already decided she wasn't worth the trouble. She wouldn't give Owen Tucker reason to become the 11th. She dressed quickly in her cleanest dress, pinned her hair neatly, and made her way downstairs to the kitchen. It was a spacious room with a large iron stove, a pump for water, and shelves stocked with basic supplies. Evidence of bachelor living was everywhere. Mismatched dishes, pots with burnt bottoms, and a general lack of organization. Zara set to work immediately, stoking the fire in the stove and examining the available food supplies. She found eggs, bacon, flour, and coffee enough for a hearty breakfast. By the time the clock on the wall showed 4:45, she had biscuits in the oven, bacon frying, and coffee brewing. Owen entered the kitchen at precisely 5 o'clock, then stopped short at the sight before him. Not only was breakfast nearly ready, but Zara had somehow managed to impose order on his chaotic kitchen. Pots hung in size order, dishes were stacked neatly, and the table was set for 3. The smell alone was enough to make his mouth water. He couldn't remember the last time his kitchen had smelled of anything but burnt coffee and half-cooked beans. Zara turned from the stove and nearly dropped the pan of biscuits when she saw him standing there. She hadn't felt his footsteps through the floor and hadn't known he was watching. She set the biscuits down carefully and wiped her hands on her apron, her expression questioning. Owen smiled and nodded approval, then wrote on the slate he'd brought with him, "Smells wonderful. The men will be here soon." As if on cue, the back door opened, and the two ranch hands entered, removing their hats as they caught sight of Zara. Owen made quick introductions using the slate. "Zara, this is Billy James and Frank Cooper. Men, this is Zara Vance. She's deaf but can read and write." Billy, the younger hand, nodded awkwardly. Frank, the older man with graying hair and kind eyes, stepped forward and extended his hand to Zara. When she hesitantly shook it, he smiled and mouthed "welcome" with exaggerated clarity. The men sat at the table while Zara served breakfast. The room fell silent except for the sounds of eating as they discovered that Zara's cooking was indeed exceptional. The biscuits were light and fluffy, the bacon perfectly crisp, and the eggs seasoned just right. "Boss," Frank said after his first bite, "you finally did something smart." Owen shot him a warning look, but his expression softened as he watched Zara move efficiently around the kitchen, already beginning preparations for the midday meal. There was a grace to her movements, a confidence that hadn't been visible during their journey to the ranch. After breakfast, Owen wrote out a list of her duties. Preparing 3 meals daily, cleaning the main house, laundering clothes once a week, and tending to the small kitchen garden. The work was substantial but fair for the wages he offered. Before heading out to begin the day's ranch work, he wrote one more note. "You can use the slate to tell me anything you need." Zara nodded, but her expression revealed skepticism. Experience had taught her that even well-meaning people quickly tired of the effort required to communicate with her. She expected Owen would be no different. The days fell into a pattern. Zara rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent mornings cleaning and organizing the previously neglected house, cooked midday meals, and used afternoons for specialized tasks like baking, mending, or gardening. By the time she served dinner, she was exhausted but satisfied with her work. Owen and his men spent their days mending fences, tending livestock, and preparing for the coming winter. Each evening, Owen would write short notes to Zara, asking about her day or explaining plans for the following morning. These brief exchanges were formal and limited to practical matters, but they were more consideration than Zara had received from most. A week passed then too. The first payment of wages was placed in an envelope on Zara's bed exactly as promised. She held the money in trembling hands, the tangible proof that her work was valued bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. The third week brought the first significant change to their routine. A sudden autumn storm blew in, forcing the men to return to the house early. With hours of unexpected indoor time, Owen found himself at loose ends. He wandered into the kitchen where Zara was kneading bread dough, her movements rhythmic and practiced. He watched her for several minutes before she sensed his presence and turned. She wiped flour from her hands and reached for the slate, but Owen shook his head. Instead, he held up a deck of cards with raised eyebrows. Zara hesitated, then nodded. She placed the bread dough in a bowl to rise and washed her hands. They sat at the kitchen table, and Owen dealt a hand of poker, using exaggerated motions to explain the rules. Zara caught on quickly, revealing a sharp mind behind her silent exterior. They played for an hour using dried beans as betting chips. By the time the bread needed to be shaped and baked, Zara had accumulated a small mountain of beans and was smiling more freely than Owen had yet seen. That evening, before retiring, Owen wrote on the slate, "You play cards well. Where did you learn?" Zara took the chalk, her expression growing serious as she wrote, "My father taught me before he died. I was 12. Owen read her words, then wrote, "What happened after?" Zara stared at the question for a long moment, then wrote a single word, "Orphanage." She handed back the slate and turned toward the stairs, signaling an end to the conversation. Owen watched her go, understanding that behind her simple answer lay a story she wasn't ready to share. The card games became a regular occurrence during bad weather or evenings when work finished early. Gradually, their communication expanded beyond practical matters. Owen learned that Zara had been born with hearing but lost it after a high fever at age 4. She had some memories of sound, particularly her mother's singing voice, but they were fading with time. Zara, in turn, discovered that Owen had built his ranch from nothing after returning from the Civil War with a leg injury that still troubled him during cold weather. He'd never married, focusing instead on establishing his business and reputation. As November arrived with its shorter days and biting winds, the household settled into a comfortable rhythm. Frank and Billy had adapted to communicating with Zara through gestures and the occasional written note. The house had been transformed from a utilitarian bachelor dwelling to a warm, organized home. Owen found himself looking forward to evenings by the fire, watching Zara's hands move gracefully as she mended clothing or worked on the quilt she was making from fabric scraps. There was a peacefulness to her presence that soothed something in him, something that had been restless and lonely for longer than he cared to admit. The first significant test of their arrangement came when Owen needed to travel to Cheyenne for supplies. The trip would take at least 5 days, and he worried about leaving Zara alone with just the ranch hands for protection. The night before his departure, he wrote a lengthy note explaining his concerns. Zara read it, then responded with firm writing, "I managed alone before. I will be fine. Frank and Billy are good men." Owen frowned at her response, not fully convinced. He wrote, "The nearest neighbor is 3 miles away. If there's trouble." Zara took the slate, erased his words, and wrote, "Trouble finds me whether I can hear it coming or not. I have survived worse than a few days alone. Go." Her determined expression brooked no argument. Owen nodded reluctantly and went to pack for his journey, wondering when exactly he'd begun to care so much about her welfare. The trip to Cheyenne was productive but longer than planned due to an early snowstorm that delayed his return. By the time Owen reached the ranch, nearly 7 days had passed, and worry had gnawed constantly at his thoughts. He rode into the yard at dusk, cold and weary. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Through the front window, he could see Zara teaching Billy how to form letters with his hands, a rudimentary form of fingerspelling she'd been developing to ease communication. Frank sat nearby, practicing the movements with surprising dexterity for his gnarled hands. The scene struck Owen with unexpected force. While he'd been worrying about Zara's vulnerability, she'd been building connections, finding new ways to bridge the silence that separated her from others. He dismounted and entered the house, stamping snow from his boots. All 3 turned at his entrance, and Zara's face lit up with a smile that warmed him more effectively than the blazing fire. That night, after a hot meal and updates on ranch business, Owen found himself alone with Zara in the main room. He took the slate and wrote, "I was worried about you." Zara read his words, then wrote, "I was worried about you too. The storm was bad." Owen stared at her response, struck by the realization that her concern was genuine. He'd become accustomed to thinking of their relationship as employer and employee, but something had shifted. The thought both pleased and unsettled him. "You were teaching Billy and Frank to spell with their hands," he wrote. Zara nodded, then explained, "Finger spelling. Easier than writing everything. I can teach you too." Owen looked at her slender fingers, remembering how gracefully they moved. The idea of learning this silent language felt strangely intimate. "I would like that," he wrote, and so began a new phase in their relationship. Each evening after dinner, Zara would patiently teach Owen the hand signs she'd developed, some learned from a traveling teacher who had briefly visited the orphanage, others of her own invention. Owen proved an apt pupil, his rancher's hands surprisingly nimble as they formed letters and simple words. The lessons brought them physically closer than they had been before. Sometimes Zara would adjust Owen's fingers, her touch light but sending unexpected warmth through his hand. Other times, Owen would watch her face as she concentrated on showing him a particular sign, noticing the fan of dark lashes against her cheek or the small furrow that appeared between her brows when she was thinking. Frank observed these lessons with knowing eyes but kept his thoughts to himself. Billy, less perceptive, simply enjoyed learning the new skill and took pride in being able to communicate with Zara without the slate. December arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow. The ranch work slowed as livestock needed only basic care and outdoor projects became impossible. Owen found himself spending more time in the house, often sitting at the kitchen table with account books while Zara baked or preserved food for the winter months. One stormy afternoon, as wind howled around the eaves, Owen noticed Zara watching the snow through the window with an odd expression. He touched her arm gently to get her attention, then signed, "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then signed back, "Snow is beautiful but silent for everyone. In snow, I am the same as you." The simple observation struck Owen deeply. He'd never considered how the seasonal silence might affect her differently than it did him. He reached for the slate, needing more words than his limited signing allowed. "Is that good or bad?" Zara took the chalk and wrote, "Both. Nice that others understand silence for a while. Sad that they find it difficult when I live in it always." Owen stared at her words, feeling as though he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as a deaf woman he'd rescued from rejection, not as his capable housekeeper, but as Zara, a person who experienced the world in ways he could barely imagine. "Show me," he wrote impulsively. "Show me your silence." Curiosity flickered in Zara's eyes. She thought for a moment, then gestured for him to follow her to the door. She took his hat and coat from the hook and handed them to him, putting on her own warm clothes. They stepped out onto the porch, where snow fell in thick, lazy flakes. The world was muffled and white, the usual ranch sounds buried under a blanket of snow. Zara took Owen's hand and led him into the yard, their boots crunching through the fresh powder. In the middle of the open space, she stopped and turned to face him. She placed her hands gently over his ears, pressing just firmly enough to block most sound. Then she stepped back and spread her arms wide, turning slowly in a circle, her face tilted up to catch snowflakes on her eyelashes. Owen stood with his ears covered, watching her. The world hadn't gone completely silent. He could still hear the muted howl of wind and his own breathing, but the effect was profound. Without sound, his other senses heightened. He noticed the exact pattern of snowflakes on Zara's dark hair, the precise shade of pink that cold brought to her cheeks, the grace of her movements as she turned in the snow. After a minute, he dropped his hands and the sounds of the world rushed back, still muffled by snow but present again. Zara was watching him with questioning eyes. "Beautiful," he signed, the gesture inadequate for what he'd experienced. She smiled, understanding the limitation of their shared vocabulary. She pointed to him, then to her ears, then raised her eyebrows in question. "What do I hear?" Owen clarified. She nodded. Owen thought for a moment, then took her hand and placed it flat against his chest, over his heart. Under her palm, his heartbeat pulsed strong and steady. Zara's eyes widened as she felt the rhythm. She kept her hand there longer than necessary, her gaze locked with his. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a possibility. The moment broke when a particularly strong gust of wind sent snow swirling around them. Owen reluctantly stepped back and gestured toward the house. As they returned to the warmth inside, something had undeniably changed. That night, Owen lay awake in his bedroom, replaying the moment in the snow. He'd brought Zara to his ranch out of a mixture of compassion and practicality. He'd needed help with the house. She'd needed work and shelter. It had been a simple transaction. But somewhere along the way, She'd become essential to him in ways that had nothing to do with clean floors or hot meals. He'd begun to see the world differently through her eyes. Her silence wasn't an absence but a different way of being, one that noticed details he missed in his sound-filled existence. And beyond that, there was the way his pulse quickened when she smiled, the warmth that spread through him when their hands touched during signing lessons, the emptiness he'd felt during his absence in Cheyenne. Owen Tucker, who'd prided himself on self-sufficiency, was falling in love with Zara Vance. The realization terrified him. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations that kept the household busy. Zara baked special treats and decorated the main room with pine boughs and red ribbons. Owen arranged for small gifts for the ranch hands and, after much deliberation, ordered a special package from Cheyenne for Zara. On Christmas Eve, Frank's wife Martha rode over from their small homestead to join them for dinner. Martha was a robust woman with a hearty laugh and kind eyes. She took to Zara immediately, watching with interest as the younger woman communicated through signs and written notes. "She's brought life back to this place," Martha commented to Owen as they watched Zara show Billy how to properly fold napkins for the table. "And to you too, I'd say." Owen shifted uncomfortably. "She's a good worker." Martha gave him a knowing look. "Is that all she is, Owen Tucker? Because the way you watch her tells a different story." Before Owen could respond, Zara turned and caught him looking at her. A slight blush colored her cheeks before she returned to her task. The Christmas Eve dinner was the most festive meal the ranch house had ever seen. The table groaned under the weight of roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and 3 different pies. Candles cast a warm glow over the gathering, and even Billy's usual boisterous manner was tempered by the occasion. After the meal, they exchanged simple gifts. Frank and Martha gave Zara a colorful shawl that Martha had knitted. Billy presented her with a small wooden box he'd carved himself. Zara, in turn, had baked special cookies for each of them and mended Frank's favorite shirt that had been torn beyond what Martha's failing eyesight could repair. When the others had received their gifts, Owen brought out a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. He handed it to Zara with uncharacteristic nervousness. She unwrapped it carefully, gasping when she revealed a beautiful journal bound in soft leather, with her initials stamped in gold on the cover. Accompanying it was a fountain pen in a velvet case. Zara looked up at Owen with questioning eyes. "For your thoughts," he signed, then added verbally for the others. "Since writing is how we first talked, I thought you might like something better than the slate." Zara ran her fingers over the smooth leather, then impulsively stood and embraced Owen, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck. It was their first true embrace, and Owen found himself returning it, his hands spanning her back as he breathed in the scent of her hair. When they separated, both were flushed, and the knowing looks exchanged by the others went unnoticed as Zara hurried upstairs to retrieve Owen's gift. She returned with a carefully wrapped package, which Owen opened to find a hand-knitted scarf in rich blue wool that matched his eyes. Beneath it lay a smaller item, a carved wooden figure of a cowboy on horseback, remarkably detailed given the simple tools she must have used. "When did you make this?" Owen asked, forgetting to sign in his surprise. Zara understood his expression if not his words. She mimed working late at night, after the others had gone to bed. "It's beautiful," Owen signed, wrapping the scarf around his neck despite the warmth of the room. "Thank you." The evening ended with Martha and Frank departing for their homestead and Billy retiring to the bunkhouse. Owen and Zara found themselves alone in the main room, the fire burning low in the grate. Owen took Zara's new journal and wrote in it, his handwriting careful and deliberate. "Merry Christmas, Zara. Having you here has made this the best Christmas I can remember." Zara read his words, then took the pen. Her response was simple but heartfelt. "For me too. Thank you for saying I wasn't broken that day in town." Owen read her words and felt something tighten in his chest. He wrote again, "You were never broken, just misunderstood." Zara's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she nodded. She took the pen once more. "You were the first person besides my parents who saw me, not just my deafness." Owen wanted to respond, to tell her how much she'd come to mean to him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached out and touched her cheek gently, wiping away a tear that had escaped. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken feelings. Then Zara stood, gathering her gifts, and signed good night before heading upstairs. Owen remained by the fire long after she'd gone, the new scarf still around his neck, wondering if he'd imagined the longing in her eyes that matched his own. The days following Christmas brought a new awareness to their interactions. Small touches lingered longer than necessary. Glances held additional meaning. Their signing lessons became opportunities for their fingers to brush against each other, sending currents of warmth through both of them. Yet neither took the final step to acknowledge what was growing between them. Owen feared taking advantage of Zara's position as his employee. Zara, with the memory of 10 rejections still fresh, feared misreading his kindness for something more. January brought the harshest weather of the winter. Blizzards kept the ranch isolated for days at a time, forcing all of them to remain indoors. Owen used the time to teach Zara about ranch operations, showing her his account books and explaining his plans for spring breeding. She absorbed the information quickly, offering suggestions that sometimes surprised him with their insight. During one particularly fierce storm, Owen found Zara in the kitchen, staring out the window with a troubled expression. He touched her shoulder gently to get her attention, then signed, "What's wrong?" She hesitated before responding, wondering what happens when spring comes. The question caught Owen off guard. He'd stopped thinking of Zara's presence as temporary, had begun to imagine her as a permanent part of his life and home. The reminder that she might be planning to leave when travel became easier again sent a jolt of panic through him. "What do you want to happen?" he signed carefully. Zara's eyes searched his face, looking for clues to his thoughts. Finally, she reached for her journal and wrote, "I'm happy here, happier than I've been since my parents died. But I'm still just your housekeeper." The last sentence held a question Owen wasn't sure how to answer. He took the journal and wrote, "You're much more than that to me." He handed it back, his heart pounding as she read his words. Her expression softened, but uncertainty remained in her eyes as she wrote, "What does that mean, Owen?" It was the first time she'd written his name, and seeing it in her handwriting affected him more than he expected. He took a deep breath and wrote, "It means I care for you, as a person, as a woman." Zara read his words, her fingers tracing over them as if to absorb their meaning through touch. When she looked up, vulnerability shone in her eyes. She wrote, "People who care for me eventually tire of the effort. My deafness becomes too much trouble." The pain behind her words struck Owen deeply. He understood then that her fear wasn't rejection based on disinterest, but the particular rejection she'd experienced repeatedly, the exhaustion others felt at accommodating her different way of experiencing the world. He took the journal again, his writing more urgent. "Your deafness is part of you, not a burden to be tolerated. I don't tire of our ways of communicating. I treasure them." Zara read his words, tears gathering in her eyes. She wrote, "I'm afraid to believe you." Owen set the journal aside. Words, written or signed, weren't enough for what he needed to express. Instead, he gently took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears that had spilled onto her cheeks. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, a question rather than a demand. Zara froze for an instant, then melted against him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. When they parted, Owen signed, I care for you. All of you. Zara's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face. She signed back, I care for you too. The admission changed everything and nothing. They still had duties to attend to, a ranch to run. But now there were stolen kisses in the kitchen, hands held under the table during meals, and evenings spent side by side before the fire, communicating in their growing language of signs and touches. February brought Valentine's Day, a holiday Owen had never celebrated before. But this year, he rode into town despite the cold to purchase a small silver brooch shaped like a heart. He presented it to Zara over dinner, enjoying the surprise and delight that lit her face. That night, sitting before the fire, Zara gave him her gift, a book of poetry she'd found among his shelves, with passages she particularly liked marked with ribbons. Together they read the poems, Owen signing the words he knew and spelling those he didn't, creating their own intimate poetry of hands in motion. As February turned to March, the weather began to soften. The first signs of spring appeared, crocuses pushing through melting snow, longer days, warmer winds. With the changing season came new challenges to their relationship. As travel became easier, visitors to the ranch increased. Not everyone reacted well to Zara's deafness or to the obvious affection between her and Owen. Some neighbors looked askance at their unmarried status. Others treated Zara with the same dismissive pity she'd experienced in town. After one particularly uncomfortable visit from a cattle buyer who had addressed all his questions to Owen, even when they concerned household matters that were Zara's domain, Owen found her angrily scrubbing pots in the kitchen. He touched her shoulder to get her attention, then signed, I'm sorry about Mr. Johnson. Zara set down the pot with enough force to send water splashing. He treated me like I was stupid, she signed, her movements sharp with anger. Deaf doesn't mean simple-minded. I know, Owen signed. He was wrong. Everyone will be like him, Zara continued, her signs becoming more agitated. They'll look at us and see a normal man burdened with a broken woman. Owen caught her hands, stilling their frantic movement. He waited until she met his eyes before signing. You are not broken. You are mine, and I am yours. The declaration hung between them, more significant than any they'd exchanged before. Zara's expression softened, anger giving way to vulnerability. Yours? She signed, the question containing multitudes. Owen nodded, then signed, If you want to be. Zara studied his face, searching for any hesitation or doubt. Finding none, she nodded slowly. I want to be, she signed, then added, but others won't understand. Owen shrugged, a gesture that needed no translation. What others thought mattered little to him compared to what they had found together. That night, lying in their separate bedrooms, both contemplated the future. Their relationship had evolved beyond employer and employee, beyond friends, into something deeper and more permanent. Yet convention and propriety kept them apart in ways that grew more difficult to bear. The following Sunday, Owen rode into town alone for supplies and to check mail that had accumulated through the winter. Among the letters was one from his sister in Denver, announcing her intention to visit in April with her husband and children. The prospect of his family's visit brought Owen's thoughts into sharp focus. He loved Zara, wanted her in his life permanently, but their current arrangement would raise eyebrows and potentially expose her to more of the judgment and rejection she'd experienced before. There was only one solution that would protect her status and make clear to everyone from nosy neighbors to his well-meaning family that Zara was not his housekeeper or a temporary arrangement, but his chosen partner in life. Before leaving town, Owen made 2 additional stops at the jeweler's shop and at the preacher's house. He returned to the ranch by mid-afternoon, finding Zara in the kitchen garden, turning soil for spring planting. She smiled when she saw him, wiping dirt from her hands on her apron before signing, "Good trip." Owen nodded, suddenly nervous about what he planned to do. He signed, "Walk with me." Curiosity in her eyes, Zara removed her apron and followed him toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. Spring had brought the water level higher, and the sound of rushing water filled the air, a sound only Owen could hear, but a sight and sensation they could both appreciate. They stopped at a bend in the creek where a large flat rock provided a natural seat overlooking the water. This was a spot they'd visited often as the weather improved, sometimes bringing a picnic lunch or just sitting together watching the changing light on the water. Owen took Zara's hands, his expression serious enough to make her own smile fade to concern. He signed, "I need to tell you something important." Zara nodded, her eyes never leaving his hands as he continued. "My sister is coming to visit next month with her family." Understanding dawned in Zara's eyes, followed by apprehension. She signed, "Should I leave before they come?" The question broke Owen's heart. Even after months of building trust, her first instinct was still to expect rejection. "No," he signed emphatically. "I want you to meet them as my wife." Zara's hands froze mid-air, her eyes widening in shock. Owen took advantage of her silence to retrieve the small box from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "Zara Vance," he signed, then spoke aloud as well, wanting to say the words even if she couldn't hear them. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Zara's eyes as she looked from the ring to Owen's face. She signed, "Are you sure? Marriage to me won't be easy." Owen smiled and signed, "Nothing worth having is easy. You are worth everything to me." He took her left hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the pearl catching the afternoon sunlight. "Yes," Zara signed, and then spoke the word aloud, her voice carrying the same unique cadence he'd heard that first day in town. "Yes." Owen pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his joy. When he set her down, he signed, "I spoke to the preacher in town. He can marry us next Sunday if you agree." Zara nodded, her smile radiant through her tears. "Next Sunday," she confirmed. "I'll need a dress." "Martha will help," Owen signed. "She's been waiting for this since Christmas." Zara laughed, the sound uninhibited and joyful. She signed, "You told her?" Owen shook his head. "She knew before I did." The week that followed was a flurry of preparation. Martha arrived the day after Owen's proposal, bringing fabric for a wedding dress and enough enthusiasm for 10 weddings. Frank spread the word to neighboring ranches, and Billy rode into town with invitations for those Owen considered friends. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, visited the ranch to discuss the ceremony. He'd never performed a wedding for a deaf person before, but was willing to adapt his usual service. Owen would interpret the important parts through sign, and Zara would respond both in sign and verbally. On the morning of their wedding day, April 12, 1879, the ranch was transformed. Bunting decorated the main house, wildflowers gathered by Billy filled every available container, and tables were set up in the yard for the meal that would follow the ceremony. Martha helped Zara dress in the simple but elegant gown they'd created, ivory cotton, with lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was arranged in a crown of braids with small white flowers woven throughout. The ceremony took place at noon under the large oak tree that stood near the house. Neighbors and friends gathered in a semicircle, with Frank standing as Owen's best man and Martha as Zara's matron of honor. Billy had polished his boots to a shine and sat proudly in the front row, signing beautiful to Zara when she appeared on Frank's arm. Reverend Thomas conducted the service with thoughtful pauses that allowed Owen to sign the important parts to Zara. When it came time for the vows, Owen both signed and spoke aloud. "I, Owen Tucker, take you, Zara Vance, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love and cherish you, to respect and honor you, to protect and provide for you, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as we both shall live. Zara, her hands trembling slightly, signed her response while speaking the words aloud. I, Zara Vance, take you, Owen Tucker, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love and cherish you, to respect and honor you, to comfort and support you, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as we both shall live. The exchange of rings followed a gold band for Owen to match Zara's engagement ring. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Owen didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. He gathered Zara in his arms and kissed her with a thoroughness that brought cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration lasted well into the evening. There was food, music, which Zara couldn't hear but enjoyed watching others dance to, and many congratulations. Mrs. Patterson from the general store in town had come, looking somewhat abashed as she presented the couple with a fine tablecloth as a wedding gift. I was wrong about you, she told Zara, speaking slowly so her lips could be read. You've found your place, and it's a good one. As the sun set, the guests gradually departed until only the ranch household remained. Frank and Martha returned to their homestead, and Billy tactfully made himself scarce in the bunkhouse. Owen and Zara stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Owen signed, "Happy." Zara's smile was answer enough, but she signed back, "Happier than I ever imagined possible." He took her hand, the new ring gleaming in the last light of day, and led her inside to begin their life together. 5 years later, 1884, the Tucker Ranch had prospered in the 5 years since Owen and Zara's wedding. What had been a modest operation had grown into one of the most successful ranches in the county, known for its well-bred cattle and fine horses. The main house had expanded too, with a new wing added to accommodate their growing family. Petra Tucker, now 3 years old, had her father's blue eyes and her mother's dark hair. At 18 months, her brother Patrick was already showing signs of his father's determined nature. Neither child was deaf, but both were learning to sign alongside their spoken language, moving effortlessly between the silent and hearing worlds. Petra, in particular, showed a gift for languages, often serving as interpreter when visitors came who didn't understand Zara's signs. The ranch itself had become something of a haven for those who didn't quite fit elsewhere. Billy had stayed on, eventually marrying a shy girl from town who had a pronounced limp from childhood polio. Frank and Martha's son had returned from back east with a degree in veterinary medicine and now lived in a small house on the property, caring for the livestock and the animals of neighboring ranches. Most surprisingly, the Tuckers had taken in 2 deaf children from the orphanage in Cheyenne, a brother and sister whose parents had died in a fire. Alice, 12, and Adam, 10, had brought new energy to the household and given Zara the opportunity to ensure they received the education and understanding she had been denied at their age. On this particular summer evening, the extended ranch family gathered on the expanded porch to enjoy the cooler air after a hot day. Owen sat in his favorite chair with Patrick dozing on his lap. Zara moved among the others, serving lemonade and cookies. Billy and his wife Sarah sat on the steps, their heads close together as they discussed plans for their own small house to be built nearby. Frank and Martha had joined them for dinner, as they often did on Sundays. They sat side by side in matching rocking chairs, Martha's knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a blanket for their expected first grandchild. Alice and Adam were teaching Petra a new game involving pebbles and a drawn circle in the dirt of the yard. Their laughter, Alice's and Adam's, with the distinctive tone of those who cannot hear themselves, floated on the evening air. Owen watched his wife move among their gathered family, her hands speaking as eloquently as any voice. 5 years of marriage had only deepened his appreciation for her strength, her intelligence, and her capacity for love. The woman who had been rejected by 10 families had created a family of her own, one bound not by blood alone but by understanding and acceptance. As twilight deepened, Zara came to sit beside Owen, taking his free hand in hers. She signed one-handed, "Look what we built." Owen followed her gaze to their assembled family, conventional and unconventional members alike, and felt a profound gratitude. He shifted Patrick to his other arm so he could sign back, "All because you weren't broken, just perfect for me." Zara's smile was as radiant as it had been on their wedding day. She leaned against his shoulder as they watched the stars appear above their home, their family, their life built together in the silence that had brought them understanding deeper than words. In the years that followed, the Tucker Ranch would become known throughout the territory as a place of innovation and inclusion. Zara would go on to establish a small school for deaf children, teaching them to read, write, and sign with dignity. Owen would serve on the territorial council, advocating for the rights of all citizens regardless of their abilities. Their children and the children they had taken in would grow up to continue their legacy in various ways. Petra as a teacher, Patrick as a rancher, Alice as a skilled seamstress whose designs were sought after in Denver, and Adam as a carpenter whose hands could build anything from a rocking horse to a two-story house. But on this quiet evening in 1884, all of that future lay ahead of them. For now, it was enough to sit together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the family they had gathered, secure in the knowledge that what others had seen as brokenness had been, in truth, the foundation of their greatest strength. The silence between them had never been empty. It had been filled with understanding, with patience, with love that needed no sound to be heard completely.